Most of us don't have the luxury of being able to focus solely on our creative projects. We have jobs, family obligations, pets, friends, and a million other things constantly competing for our time. In an average day, I may ambitiously plan on giving myself the gift of time to create and express myself, only to realize that I'm behind on laundry, I need to prep food for the week, I have to walk the dog, oh, and I should swing by the grocery store to restock on necessities. After an 8-hour workday, suddenly my creative time is cut down to virtually nothing. I have no energy, and all I want to do is scroll on my phone until I'm ready to fall asleep. Ideally, I would love to secure an old-fashioned patronage to match my current salary and allow me to focus more on my writing, but realistically, that's not going to happen. So, instead, I sought out the wisdom of some folks who are experts at juggling multiple responsibilities and still investing in their creativity. In today's video, you will meet Caroline Catto, a multi-hyphenate with a rich professional background, a knack for nurturing others, and a creative spirit. I expected us to really focus on productivity and prioritization, but as the conversation unfolded, I quickly realized that Caroline's insights extended into the creative process more broadly and could be a healthy framework for freeing busy writers from the emotional burden of feeling like they're not doing enough to live up to the moniker writer. So, let's go ahead and dive in.
Had to go through and take some notes about all of the things that you do simultaneously because it's a pretty long list. You're the director of Nectar, a new food system innovations initiative, a board member at Renewal Mill, a women-run startup that you co-founded, and an emeritus board member of the Upcycled Food Association. You also regularly advise and mentor startups across a variety of industries. And perhaps most importantly, you still take time to go rock climbing, biking, running, or to cook meals with your friends. A mutual connection of ours recommended that I reach out to you for this series of content because you're good at navigating priorities, which I think is what she said. But holy cow, I think that's an understatement because you do a lot of different things. So I'm curious to get started if you can just tell me a little bit about your journey and what led you to doing all of these different things simultaneously.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks so much for having me on. I honestly have just, I think I was sort of born with the bug of like needing to do a lot of things at once. And sometimes to my detriment, like I think I really struggle with just doing nothing and sort of like relaxing and sitting still, and not to sort of have that be a humble brag of like, oh, relaxing is hard. But I think I've just always been somebody that's motivated by like the pressure of time and wanting to say like, oh, time is limited, I need to sort of maximize this and explore all of these things that are interesting to me. So the sort of story of my career is that I've really been fascinated by food and have tried to explore that from as many different angles as possible, which has kind of led me to say yes to a lot of things and really live by that sort of improv comedy philosophy of like yes and like people come to me and they're like, oh, would you be interested in doing this, or I seek it out and then I'm like, okay, that's really cool, and then how can I like yes and build on that because I met this other person doing this really cool thing and I think we need to like work together. So at a high level, I've sort of explored food from the nutritional aspect, was really deep on like child obesity and child malnutrition. I randomly studied abroad in China, got obsessed with their food culture and like ended up spending time in Taiwan. Then came back to the States and saw a posting for a job at HubSpot, was like, wow, they're doing some really cool stuff in culture. Jumped over there for a bit and then felt called back to the food space and ended up taking what I learned at HubSpot in tech and applying that to food. And that's what I've been up to for the last better half of the decade here.
Amazing. And so I guess thinking about like the work that you're doing as a director and as a board member and as a mentor, like what does your average work week look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's definitely always evolving. So I would say I do like I normally work kind of like 9 to 5-ish in my role as a director, but I carve out time for things that are important to me. So I have been carving out like at least an hour a week for mentorship conversations. I have some companies that I meet with on like a biweekly basis, as well as some like, I'll get a lot of ad hoc outreach from LinkedIn, and I really try to make time for those conversations on like, Friday afternoons, to make sure that I'm kind of giving back and paying it forward, because I've been helped by a lot of people who I reached out to apropos of nothing, and they've shared their time generously with me. So make time for that. For my board member commitments, they've kind of ebbed and flowed over the last 4 years. I was kind of spending upwards of 10 hours a week on board commitment stuff. It's slowed a little bit right now, so it's more of a quarterly commitment with sort of reviewing and being available for calls as people need help on certain problems that arise. And then, yeah, I try to keep really strict boundaries with myself with work, because I've struggled with that in the past. And so I pretty much do not work on the weekends, and I do not work pretty much after like 6 p.m. I really try to keep that time sacred for pursuing other hobbies, because I think I've seen that, making time for other things makes me a better employee and a better mentor and a better board member, because I just have that space to be more creative and available.
So I kind of want to like leap out of my seat as you're saying that, because there's so much that I want to talk about within that statement alone. The first thing that comes to my mind is like so much online about what does success look like, what does productivity look like. There are a million like think pieces always popping up about how like you have to get up at 4 a.m., have your cold shower, and then it's just hustling and grinding until 10 p.m. And then like you have I don't know, a big steak, and you get up and do it again. And I've always found those sort of like pseudo productivity articles to be more like, this is a gimmick that I can market to you because it sounds like this is what a successful person should do, but there's not really substance there. And what you're describing sounds much more sustainable, but also much gentler. And I'm curious, like, if you can comment on that, and if there's been any times in your experience where those like trendy techniques or think pieces have ever made you like doubt yourself or question your approach.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, I'm speaking to you now from like a much calmer time in my life than the last 6 years, honestly. So for context, for the last 6 years, I've been running a small venture-backed startup called Renewal Mill. And yeah, definitely, I have suffered from burnout, honestly, because I think there's this entrepreneur myth that you have to sort of fall on the sword, that you have to be doing just exactly what you described, like burning the candle at both ends, whatever metaphor you want to use, but like you can only take Saturdays off, you need to be constantly available. And I just found myself like between the constant pseudo productivity pings of Slack and email and investor needs, it really leads directly to burnout. And I can name off the top of my head at least 10 friends I know that have had to either shut down their startup or step back from a leadership position in their startup in the last 6 months because of burnout or some health related consequences of that type of behavior. So I think I spent the last 4 months really trying to unlearn a lot of that. I think it was catalyzed heavily by the pandemic. I felt like my startup is 3 people, we're kind of early days, like we lost 90% of our revenue overnight with the pandemic and offices shutting down, like we need to pivot quickly. And that led to working like 16-hour days and, not having any boundaries. I think where I am today is I recently read Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. Really loved that book. I also read The Good Enough Job. And I think both of those books are kind of making the case for like this hyper always on mentality is not the way that the best thinkers in history have thought, and we need to get back to a place where we're including seasonality both into our days and our years, and we're working sort of smarter, not just harder in terms of like longer hours. So it's hard, because I think if you're an entrepreneur at heart, you have this sort of like go, go, go mentality, like everything rests on my shoulders. But I honestly think it makes you a better entrepreneur in the long term if you're building in something that's sustainable for yourself.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think in my own entrepreneurial journey, I've also found myself at places where thankfully it hasn't manifested in like health issues yet. But that's wow, that was a dire statement. But yeah, I have absolutely reached the point where I get to the point of burnout, and then it's like I cannot push my mind any further. And something that should be a simple, like 10-minute look at it, make a decision, becomes a 2-day long process of, oh my God, this is the most stressful thing I've ever experienced. And for me, that's when I know, like, okay, I've been going not at a healthy pace. I need to step back. I need to slow down. I'm not making space for my hobbies, for me to get out in nature, for me to have a good meal, for me to exercise. Like, I need to catch my breath, or this is just not going to work well for anybody.
Totally. Yeah. And I think when you get to that point, like taking a 2-week vacation doesn't solve it necessarily. Like it really has to be that habit of practice of like keeping yourself accountable to yourself, of like, in order to be the best decision maker, the best mentor, the best friend, like I really have to keep sort of solid boundaries. And I've found that when you're in that frenetic sense, like I wasn't being the best leader I could be, because my just nervous system's in overdrive at that point.
Well, you've mentioned protecting that time to engage with your hobbies. And you've also mentioned being the type of person who's more naturally inclined to a challenge and to staying busy. And I'm curious, do you ever find those two aspects of yourself at odds?
I mean, I think I can over index on hobbies and things like that. Like I'm really, you know, exercise is really important. Moving my body is really important. And I feel like sometimes I'll look at my weekend, which is supposed to be sort of a period of rest and recovery from the week. And it's like jam-packed back to back with activities of like seeing friends and, trying to get outside and trying to make time for creative pursuits like writing or reading. So that's definitely something I'm also looking to it's constantly within me. How do I sort of slow down? Like it's okay to only have one thing planned for the weekend, or like take a rest day to just kind of sit and do nothing. I think there's a lot of power in that, and that's where I feel the tension most. But I am an extrovert, so I get a lot of joy out of sort of engaging with other people and like keeping those points of communication open. So I would say more than the average person, I probably pack my free time full of hobbies as well.
Awesome. Well, speaking of your hobbies, one of the things that we touched on briefly before we started recording is that you actually mentioned that recently you've been starting to get back into writing a little bit more. And that was another one of those moments where I could have leapt out of my seat, because I didn't realize that you were also a writer. And I'm curious if you could just tell me a little bit about your background as a writer and what it is that you write.
Yeah, I think I like whenever you're like, oh, you're a writer, I like bristle a little bit, because I feel like, I don't necessarily feel like a writer, but I have enjoyed writing as a method of sort of self-exploration and like teaching over the last few years. So I used to do a lot of traveling for work and otherwise, and kept a like weekly blog for a long time as a way to just like process everything I was seeing in foreign countries and sort of my experience there. And then I used a lot of that content of personal experience for stand-up comedy. So something when I lived in Boston, I was like really intrigued by sort of performance of stand-up comedy and how you can like write and revise that type of work. And then actually through my experience at HubSpot, I had a mentor, Katie Burke, who was really great at encouraging me to sort of like share what I've learned. And so ended up writing a lot of like how-to pieces specifically around like women in the workplace, like how to encourage women in the workplace, or like when I ultimately ended up leaving HubSpot, how to make career transitions in a way that feels authentic and like not scary. So that's what most of my writing has centered on to date. But then I started the startup and took a long hiatus and really did not make the time for it. So it's only been in sort of the last 6 months that I've been trying to get back to writing, and have recently been really intrigued by poetry, honestly. How do you sort of write short format things that are impactful? And I've been taking a class recently on just like generative writing. Like, how do you get back into the habit of just writing and not editing yourself before something even gets on the page?
I love that. I love that. I think that feeling of I write, but I kind of bristle at being called a writer is so common. And I personally am almost militant about like if you write and you get satisfaction out of writing, I want you to call yourself a writer. I want you to own that. So I'm so fascinated because when I think about like you and your track record, I would look at you and I think a lot of people, especially who are maybe early on in their, writing journeys, or who are thinking about like, maybe starting up like a freelancing career or something, I think we would look at your portfolio and be like, oh yeah, that is a successful writer. So I think to hear you say like, I don't know if that label is like a right fit for me, just is so fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think something I've also been working on is like defining myself by verbs rather than nouns. I think
Mm.
one of the things I, have recently been reflecting on, and some of those books I mentioned, is sort of like the loss of religion in the US has led millennials and Gen Z folks to really define themselves by their career. And that often leads to these nouns like I am an entrepreneur, I am a writer. And I am trying to get back to a place where I'm like, I'm Caroline and I do writing, I do, entrepreneurship, like all of these sort of, more active things of like, I bike, I hike, rather than just, describing myself by one thing, because I've reinvented myself in my career multiple times at this point. And I think everybody should feel empowered to do that. Like, just because you've done one thing doesn't mean that you're in that box. Like, you're continually writing the story of your life. And for me, all I care about is that being an interesting and fulfilling one.
Wow. And as you were saying that, one of the things that made me think is like, I wonder if that sort of identifying and labeling can also contribute to feelings of burnout. Because, hearing the way that you phrase that, sometimes when I sit down to write, especially after a long work day, it feels like more work. And that can be a challenge because writing for me has always been a form of escapism. It's been a form of self therapy, of processing, of healing. Uh, and when it feels like work, I think some of that is lost. And I wonder, if that like this is occupation versus like this is a thing that a person, do. I wonder if that plays into it. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, I think I've also been victim to like not acting because I care about what other people are going to think about sort of what I'm going to do, or sort of what I'm putting out into the world. And I think I was plagued more with it in my 20s, but especially with platforms like social media and LinkedIn, like way more people are watching or like my perception was that way more people are watching of what I was doing in terms of my career than ever before. And having that tied up nicely with a bow of terms of like, this is my title, this is what I do, had maybe prevented me from making some leaps that I would have made sooner if I didn't feel that pressure.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I think, a tricky balance because for people who want to write professionally or who want to have, I think what's probably most common, that blend of I write for joy, but then at times I write for publication or, for a little bit of money on the side. You sort of have to do like a tightrope act where you have to have that public facing persona that says, oh, I'm a writer who does XYZ, and this is my specialty. This is, this pretty CV that you, as someone who hires writers, will want to look at. But then you kind of have to have that like secret garden of an inner life that says, okay, I can put down corporate writer or professional writer and just go play with words.
Totally. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I feel like we went on a complete adventure away from what I initially anticipated, getting on and talking about balancing and productivity. But I also feel like that adventure was warranted and has gotten me to reflect on some things about my militant stance on saying, no, claim it, you're a writer. And maybe that's not always going to be the best stance moving forward. But thank you so much for joining me. And I'm curious as we wrap up, if you have any final parting words of wisdom or a book recommendation that you think folks should hear.
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, I feel like most of what I've been reading is nonfiction on how to heal burnout and how to be more productive. So I definitely mentioned those two at the top of the call. But I guess another recommendation would be the book This I Believe. Um, it's a collection of essays of all sorts of people from like Albert Einstein to the like a local pizza delivery guy on like what they believe about who they are or like one premise in their life. And I think it's a really interesting peek into sort of the psyche of different people and this idea of like how you define yourself. So would definitely recommend checking that out. And I think my last like parting word of wisdom would be like the way that I really like to define my life is by just like following my curiosity, and would say if you're interested in something, go do it. Like don't put up false barriers for yourself. Like you can change careers, you can change who you are, you can change your identity, and you're really in control. So would just encourage people to do that. And I also think not getting swept up in what society tells you you should be doing is really important.
And I promise I did not prompt you to say anything about following your curiosity. My brand is Howdy Curiosity. And so like that is on brand. And yeah, got some snaps from me when you said that.
I love it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.